Hello guys, this is CodeNCode and this is 7th lecture of Spring Boot backend course. In this course, we are building backend service or backend APIs for restaurant app, right? Till the last lecture, we have basically implemented food item API, and also we have learned how you can perform testing using Postman, right? In this lecture, we are going to add user API. So we'll add how you can add users, right? You can add endpoints for login and sign up and so many other things, right? So let's go ahead and add user related APIs. All right, so as you can see, I've created a new branch, L07, so lecture 07. So since this is the 7th lecture, any changes that I'll make in this lecture will be available in lecture 07, right? So what we are going to do, we are going to add user APIs, right? So of course we need a user table. So let's start with the entity. We need a user entity, right? Let's call it user. Let's define it as an entity, and also I'm going to define the name of the table as users. See, the username user is actually a reserved keyword, that's why you can't use it in the SQL. So you can define it as users. Now what do we need here? So first of all, let's define UUID ID. I'll need first name, right? And I'll need last name. Of course, I'll need email, first name, last name, email. Beside this, I'm not going to add phone number. Let's define local date time created. Yeah, when was the profile created, right? And local date time modified or updated. It's up to you, whatever you would like to name. So these are the fields I want this users to have, right? ID, first name, last name, email, when was it created, and when was it modified. Sorry, as you can see, we are using local date time here, and when we define food item, we used local date. Local date will only have the date, not the time. That's why in this table we were not having time along with the date, right? So you can go ahead and change it if you want to. I'm going to leave it as it is because this is just for the learning purpose, this whole project, and I'm leaving this as an exercise for you to do. So the more you do, the more you learn, right? So I've already told you, if you want, you can change that to local date time. Now UUID is ID, so let's define, let's make sure that this is an ID. So you can define ID, and then you can also define generation strategy. Yeah, generated value strategy would be UUID, right? So this is the unique ID, and the system will generate the UUID itself. Now my bad. So first name, we need to add some validation that it should not be blank. So at the rate not blank, we can add a message that first name cannot be empty. All right, so basically it will validate whether the first name is empty or not. If it is empty, it will throw an error with this message, right? Now last name is fine. It is possible that some people may not have last name, so we're not going to add a non-blank validation there. Email, yeah, first of all, it should not be blank. So error message, email ID cannot be empty. All right, one of the validation is that it cannot be null. The second thing is it should be a valid email. So for that, you can add @email. So this is another, we see here, first of all, message, of course, message equals, so non-blank and email. So both of these validation we are going to add here. So email, again message, please, we can add if the email provided is invalid, this error will be thrown with this message that we are going to add, please provide a valid email. All right, yeah, for email, done. All right, and for email, there's one more thing that I want. Email should be unique, right? Each person can have only one email according to our system. It is possible, there are scenarios where you would like to allow users to have multiple emails, but for our case, we are only restricting the user to have only a single email. So a single email belongs to a single person. If someone tries to create another account with another email, should not happen. So @ column, right? And in here you can add unique is equals to true. All right, so this will make sure that email is unique, right? Yeah, so we are done with the users. So if we run ahead, if we run, you can see here, in here we are saving all of the tables. So we have food item table only, just forget these three, right? So this is our table. So we have the food item table. If we run it here, it will generate a new table. So if I go ahead and generate a new table, it will generate a new table. Hopefully we don't get any error, and we can see the newly generated table there. Yeah, there's no error, and as you can see, create table command executed. So if we come back here, refresh it, we have users table also, right, with columns id, created, email, first name, last name, and modified, right? You can go back here. Yes, we have added users entity. Now let's go ahead and add the repository, service, and controller. All right, so let's go ahead and create a repository. So interface, and let's call it user repository. Okay, and this extends JPA repository. Yes, so we have users, import, and then UUID. Right, so users that we have defined, user table, and then UUID. We have already discussed how you define this, right? So now we have a repository. Now we can go ahead and define service. Let's define a user service. User service, right? So first of all, go back to repository and annotate it with repository. Yeah. Now we have service, annotate it with service, right? This is the user service. Here we would need the repository, because service is the class that does the job of basically here we define the business logic. It needs to interact with the database. It directly can't interact with the database, and the job of interacting with the database is of repository, so we must have repository here. So private, why is it happening? I don't know. Okay, private final user repository. Yeah, because we are not going to change the user repository at all, so we can define it final @autowire. Yeah, because this might have not been initialized. Okay, let's remove final, otherwise it will keep on throwing this error. There's another way to inject it. We are using field injection. You can use a constructor, and you can use the constructor injection, then most likely you won't get this error. Okay, as you can see, field injection is not recommended, so you can use constructor injection, right? You can define a constructor, inject user repository there. Now that we have service, we can define different methods here to find a user, add a user, create a user, things like that, like things we have defined here, right? Save a user, get all users, things like that. So let's start with the very basic one, that is get all users. So it will return a list of users, and I'll call it get all users. All right, and from here we'll return repository dot find all. It will return all of the users, right? So now one of the business logic we have added here. So we have repository, we have service, we have entity. Now let's define a controller just to test the whole workflow, right? Then we can keep on adding other things. So for user, let's define a controller, call it user controller. All right, add that rest controller, and what was that? I just keep on forgetting the name. Request mapping. Yeah, that's it. Request mapping. Request mapping to define what would be the entry point for this controller. Let's call it user only, right? So anything that is base address / user will come here, right? So as we already know, controller directly interacts with the service. So let's inject that here. So private user service, let's call it user service and annotate it with @autowire. So basically injecting user service here. Now we have service, we can perform actions here. So since we have defined one in the service, we have defined business logic to get all of the users, right? We can add an endpoint here to return all of the users, right? So we can define response entity. First of all, this is going to be a get mapping because it would be a get request. Get mapping, right? Slash user slash all, right? Localhost slash user slash all will return all of the users. So we'll return a response entity of list of users. List of users. Okay. Alt enter and then import the class. Of course, import list also. So get all users. From here you can return new response entity user service. Okay, my bad. User service dot one thing again. We define the function and I define the function and actually forgot to make them public so they are accessible. So here dot get all users and then http status code we are going to return 200 okay because this would be a successful response, right? My bad. Now that we have defined repository, service, controller, let's go ahead and try running it, right? Okay, no issue as of now. So if we go back here in our postman and add request, yeah, let's call it 7 get all users, right? So it could be get request, of course, localhost colon 8080 yeah, slash user slash all, and this would be a get request. Let's save it. If I hit it, I'll get a list of users, and as we have not added any users, it is still empty, but the whole process is working just fine. That means we can go ahead and define other business logic here in the service. So let's go ahead and add other functions here. All right, so let's go ahead and define a method to save the users, right? So public save, right? And public, let's say UUID save user. We'll have a user and we'll save it, right? To save the user, what we are going to do, first of all, user dot set. We haven't defined getters and setters in here, so let's define getter and setters. So alt insert, you will get this, and here you can select getters and setters. We need getters and setters for every single field. We are not going to set the UUID ourselves because it is auto generated, so let's remove the setter. Now that we have getters and setters, I can set created date, right? So whenever we are going to insert a user in the database, we are going to update its created date. Since save user is basically creating a new user, so created date will be updated. So we are using local date time, right, dot now. So it will add a date time in here. Once we have the user updated, we can actually save it. So user saved user is equals to repository dot save. When you call the save function, what it will do, it will save it and also return the entity, the saved entity, right? So once we have the saved entity, we can return its ID. So what I'm doing here, the save user, I want it to return the user ID, right, after creation, because initially when you pass on the user, it won't have a UUID. UUID is auto generated, so this saved user will have auto generated user ID, and that is exactly what I'm returning from here. All right, so yeah, this is the user that we are saving in the database. And now let's go ahead in the controller, add an endpoint to save a user. So this will be a post mapping. We are going to create a new user or create a new entity in the database. So it would be slash save or register. or login or sign up. I think sign up makes more sense. Sign up. All right. Yes. Okay. So what I'm doing here, we are going to return. Doesn't not necessary actually. So we are going to return a response entity of UUID, because from the service we'll get the UUID, and that UUID, that is the user ID, we can return from here. Sign up function will get a user and add the request body. Basically you can pass on the user, right, as JSON, and that will be converted into the user using the request body. You already know that, and we have learned in the lecture 5. Another thing, important thing here is that we need to validate that this user is actually valid. So @valid, as we have learned earlier, that how you can enforce entity validation, right? So this way it will validate that the user is valid. Like basically it will validate these things, right? And if there is any issue, it will report it. So throw an exception which will be handled here. What I'm going to do, as you can see, this exception, this method argument invalid exception, is actually a common exception that can be thrown from any entity. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to move it out of food item handler exception. I want food item handler exception to be specific for food item exceptions. This is common to all the entities, so I'm going to add a new exception handler, right? Exception handler, and in here I'm going to add that. So this I'm going to move from here to here, because this one is for the common, this is common, right? Yeah. And this, yeah, annotated as controller advice, other thing is fine. Yeah. All right, so yeah, I moved it into the common exception handler, right? So yeah, this error is common, so it will be handled here. Makes sense. Now from the controller, the user controller, what we are going to do, first of all, we'll validate that the user is valid or not. If it throws any error exception, that would be handled here in the exception handler, right? Otherwise, what we can do, we can go ahead and save it. So user service dot save user, and I can pass save, but it returns a UUID. So UUID ID, right? Once I have the ID, I can return the response, new response entity ID, and as you can see, status code we are returning created, that is 201, because we are adding a new field into the database, right? Just to make sure, if you go back here, that's exactly what we are doing here. There's nothing different. So now that we have added a sign up endpoint, let's go ahead and test it. Initially, as you can see here, in this users table, there's nothing, right? Like we can verify it using select star from world.users, right? If I run this, as of now, there's nothing. Yeah, nothing. ID, created email, XYZ, everything is empty, right? It's running fine. Let's add an endpoint, basically duplicate it. This one will be 7, and I'll call it add user, right? First of all, this is a post call /user/ sign up, right? Inside the body you can pass JSON. What fields are you required to pass? If you go back to the user entity, you can see here that we have ID, it is auto generated, first name, last name, email, first name, last name, and email. These are the 3 fields that we need to pass. So we can define first name. First name will be, let's call it code. Last name, right? Last name, let's say encode. Email, CodeNCode@gmail. All right, the code and code, and this is, so if we, okay, 4 has 0, first name cannot be empty, first name. Did I make a mistake? Just a second. In here, inside the body, okay, it's only name. So if I go back here, first name cannot be empty. I'm making no spelling mistakes. So back here, let's have a look at the first name. Yeah, it's all right. Okay, one thing, if you send it, no errors. The thing is that these fields will be mapped into, come back here, yeah, here, to these fields, right? And since its name is first name, right, so in the Java class, its name is, this field name is first name, right, using camel case. So I have to provide that thing. I was a bit confused. So for the last name, I have to use this, right? So these are not mapped directly to the database. First, it will be mapped to the Java class, and that's why we need to provide the exact field name as we have used in the entity. That is first name using camel case, last name as camel case, and email is email. So no issues there. So if we go back and look at this, most likely, yeah, this is the ID. I'm not looking at that. Creation date is this, along with the time, right? Date and time. And email is fine. Last name is empty, because last time when we passed the last name, it was not using camel case, so it was not properly mapped, right? Last name we passed as this, which was not properly mapped. So yeah, one thing to remember. So if I try to add the same thing again, 500 internal error, we have to handle this exception also. I'll tell you what. So as you can see, we are getting 500 internal server error, and we are not getting any specific error. The thing is, the exception this time thrown is this, because of the unique constraint, because I'm trying to save again using the same email ID, and SQL will throw an exception. So what exception was thrown here? We can see here, and duplicate entry, right? And what is the exception? It is SQL integrity constraint violation exception. So we have to handle that exception also. We'll do that in a moment. But yeah, the thing is that using the same email ID, you can't handle, or you can't add multiple basically entries in the users table, because we have added the constraint unique, right? Unique constraint. So yeah, so basically our endpoint is working fine, and we'll make sure that we are handling this exception also. All right, we'll do that using the controller advice, right? So yeah, basically our endpoint is working fine. And since this is working fine, if I go back here and try to fetch all of the users, this time I'll get the users, right? Because we have added a user. Here's its ID, the first name, last name is as of now null, email ID, creation date and time, and update modified is null, because we have not modified it yet. So successfully added an endpoint for the sign up, right? Let's go ahead and add other endpoints also. All right, so before we add other endpoints, let's handle that exception also. So remember, just now we got an exception from SQL, so let's handle that also. So here you see this is exception handler, and unfortunately exception handler is also another class. So let's rename it first. Okay, let's call it common exception handler. Okay, refactor, rename, let's call it common exception handler. Okay, I can import it now. These two are having the same name, that's why to distinguish between them, we had to write the whole name here. All right, so we were getting an exception, SQL integrity violation exception, something like that. Let's handle that also here. So at the rate exception handler, SQL integrity, my bad, yeah, integrity constraints violation exception. This is the exception that we were getting, right? Okay, this is the exception that we'll get. Let me close this. So this is the name of the method which we can name anything. So handle the exception, and this is the exception we'll get, right? This is the exception that is thrown when whatever constraint you have defined on entity, for example this unique constraint is not followed, basically this is violated, then we'll get this exception. Once we have this exception, what we can do, return a string from here, as string of response entity of a string. So return response entity, we get the message from the exception, and also it return back bad request, right? So if you go back here, so you remember when we were running the service earlier and we were trying to save this again, right? So we were getting 500 internal error, which is not a good way. It only tells you that there's something happened on the server. You don't get the actual messages, the error messages. Now since we are handling the exception ourselves, we'll actually get back an error message. So as a client, I'll know that yeah, this is the mistake that I've made and this is what I need to change, right? So if I try to add the user again, see, first of all 400 bad error. Other thing is this, I'm getting a proper message, duplicate entry for this email ID. All right, yeah, so clearly we are getting a proper message, right, that yeah, we are using duplicate email ID. So exception we have handled. Let's go back to the controller, start with the service. We have just added an endpoint. We have added basically business logic to save a user. We have added business logic to get all the users. What other things we had added, like save it, get all food items, right, and update, delete, and food item by ID. These things we can do, right? Yeah, so let's define public yeah, user, get user by ID. We'll have a user ID, and then we can simply, what we can do, we can first of all, let's see, we have the repository, user repository dot find by ID. We are providing the ID, right? And as you can see, this actually returns an optional, right? So I can save it in the optional of user. It's called user. So I'm trying to find user by ID using the repository, right? And then saving the result in the user. It returns an optional, so we can check whether this is empty or not. If this is empty, that means we didn't find it. So if you don't find it, you can simply return invalid ID exception that we had defined here, right? You can return that. So yeah, find by ID, you can do that. So if you come back here, you can check if user is empty. If it is empty, what you can do, you can throw an exception, throw new invalid ID exception, right? Provided there is no user with ID ID, right? You can throw this exception, and of course you need to define here that throws invalid ID exception. If that is not the case, you can actually return the user, which is user.get, right? So get by ID is working fine. Delete public remove user, right? Public void, I'm not doing anything here. Remove users. I'll get a user ID and I can go ahead and delete it, right? So let's make sure both of these services are using the same thing. Here I'm passing the food item to delete the user, and here I'm using only ID, right? Let's keep it consistent. Pass the user, complete user here, right? So remove user, this is the user that we want to remove. First of all, we need to make sure that the user actually exists in the database. So let me just do this, bring it down. Okay, let's check whether this user exists or not. If so, what I can do, I can get user, oh my bad, yeah, saved user is equals to get user by ID, user dot get ID. So what I'm doing here is that I'm calling this, right? If I'm getting user by ID, right, so it will throw an exception. If the user doesn't exist, it will throw an exception, so I don't have to check it myself, right? So throws invalid ID exception. Otherwise I'll again check from the repository whether the user ID exists or not, then perform the check whether this is empty or not, things like that. So I don't want to do that. I already have get user by ID. I'll directly utilize that. If the user doesn't exist, it will already throw an exception telling that the user ID is invalid, right? That is not the case. I have a user, I can delete it. Simple, right? So get all user, delete user, and then there is an update, right? Public void update user. First of all, I'll fetch the saved user, right? And again, I can utilize the same function, get user by ID. I have a user, and once I have, again, if it is not there, it will throw an exception, and we are throwing it back from here, right? It will be handled in the exception handlers. Now, yeah, here the thing is that if that is not the case, that means we have found the user. We can simply update it, right? We have found the user, so what we'll do, we'll update the user here. But before updating it, let's make sure again we are consistent with both of the services. So what we are doing in updation, of course I'll update it, and then yeah, just saving it for the updation. So what we can do, user dot set modified, right? Again, local datetime dot now, and then in my repository, user repository, I can call the save function. One thing for you is that modify certain part of it. Important thing is that what you can do, you can check whether the user is trying to modify the email ID. It shouldn't be allowed. We, according to our system, we are not allowing user to modify the user ID, right? So if someone is trying to modify the user ID, you can check it here and throw an exception. Okay, let's do it ourselves. So the way we have defined here, let's define invalid operation exception, right? So invalid operation exception, right? Extends exception. You can define its constructor, and from here you can pass the message back to the superclass, right? So here in the user service, if someone tries to change the email address, so what you can do, if saved user, first of all, it won't be saved user, yeah, if saved user dot get email dot equals, yeah, if the new email is not same as the saved user email, that means we are trying to change the email address, just not, right? If it is not same, then we are trying to modify the user email ID, which is not allowed. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to throw an exception from here, throw new invalid operation exception that we have defined just now, and here you can mention that user is not email ID cannot be modified, right? And of course you need to mention it here that you are throwing invalid operation exception also. If that is not the case, I'm going to update it, right? As simple as that. So we have updated the service class. Let's go ahead and update the controller, right? From here I have sign up, and what other add points we had, get all we have defined, get by ID, let's define that, and then delete and update, get by ID, delete and update, let's do that. So get by ID will return a user response entity of user, right? Get by ID, right? And it's going to be a get mapping slash user slash get slash ID, right? This is again a path variable, so we are going to cast it here at the path variable, right? So we have the ID. What we can do, we can fetch it using user service dot get user by ID. We can pass UUID, right? When we pass the ID, what it does, it throws exceptions, so we have to do that. We have to handle the exceptions, and also it returns the user, right? So user is equals to by ID, throws invalid id exception. Yeah, we have the user. Once we have the user, we can return new response entity with the user and status code. Okay, so this is to get by id, right? And yeah, if that is not the case, invalid id exception will be thrown. That will be handled again in the exception handler, right? So this is to get the id, and let's define an endpoint to update the user. Again, post mapping slash update. So it is like a localhost slash localhost colon 8080, basically base address slash user slash update. When you're going to update it, you're going to get a user, basically new user, updated user, right? Let's call it updated user, right? And yeah, so what we can do, we can call after updating in the service, after updating update user, right? We are not doing anything, but we should return from here user, which is basically the updated user. So updated user is this one because we have modified the, basically we are saving it here. It returns updated user, right? It returns the entity whatever you are trying to save. So save function returns the entity that would be your updated user, and you can return it from here, right? So I'm returning an updated user here. Is the issue? I can directly return from here. Makes sense? Yeah. So in the controller, what I'm going to do, user controller, I'm going to modify the user. I'm going to return the updated user as well, right? So user is equals to service, which is user service dot update user, updated user. I'm trying to save it here. It will throw some exceptions. We need to define that here, that it throws these many exception, invalid id exception. And yeah, while saving, invalid not name is invalid operation exception. These are the two exceptions we were throwing from the updated update user function, right? Because someone if tries to change the email address, this exception will be thrown, right? Once we have updated the user, I can directly return this user. Yeah, okay, so we have added endpoint for fetch by id. We have added endpoint for updating the user. Yeah, okay. And what other endpoints we can add? Yeah, delete a user, at the rate delete mapping, right? Slash, let's call it remove user, basically. Yeah, so from here, first of all, remove throws only invalid id exception, right? From here, I'll get the user, I'll call service.remove user. It only throws invalid id exception, not the other one. So this, and response entity, I'll return yeah, there's nothing to be returned. I can simply return new response entity, okay, with status code, okay, that yeah, the operation was successfully performed, right? That means deletion was performed. If the invalid the id was invalid, it will already throw an exception, so the user would know, the client would know that they made some issues, right? And remove user, yeah, it returns nothing. So in the controller, we have added get by id, update user, and remove. These three endpoints we have added. Let's go ahead and test this. Stop and rerun. Let's try fetch by id, add a user, duplicate, let's call it 8, get user by id, right? That is 8, and it would be a get call, right? I'm going to get by id. I'm not providing anything here. So yeah, get by id slash user slash get slash id, right? So the endpoint is slash user slash get slash id. So id is this. What was that? I have already added it here, so I need the ID. Okay, let's go ahead and first of all remove it. Everything from the user. Let's delete everything from the users. All right, so deleted. As you can see, empty table. Let's start from here. Add a user. Added a user, and this is its ID. Get user by ID. Working fine. We are getting the details here. ID, first name, last name, email address, created, add, modified, right? Just change it here and you'll get a proper error message. There is not user, there is not user, no, not user with an ID. Okay, we need to change the error message. So in the, yeah, in this service, I think there's no user instead of not. Okay, basically it's working fine, right? The get user by ID endpoint is also working fine, right? And once we have that, what we can do, we can test another endpoint, which is basically update and remove. All right, so let's go ahead and test those also. So let's test the update and remove endpoints, right? For update, let's copy this one, duplicate. This 7, 8, this should be 9, this should be 10, right? So let's 10 update user, right? Slash update, and this is a post call. Update is a post mapping, right? Now control S. So I'm getting all of the users. Yeah, it is already updated. Let's just go ahead and delete all of the users first, and I'll start from the beginning. As of now, there is nothing. Start from the basic, right? First of all, add a user. Working fine. This is its ID. Let's copy. Then get user by ID. Working fine. Let's just copy this. Now I'm going to update the user, right? Body, update the user. As of now, you can see the modified is null, right? And last name is endcode. Let's change it to Ahmed, right? Code Ahmed modified, as you can see, is null. Okay, last name is still all right. Let's see what have we. All right, so as you can see, when we are going to update the user, we are fetching to make sure that the user actually exists before updating. We are fetching the user from the DB, and I'm saving the saved user back into the DB again. That's why there's no change. I should save this one, the modified user, right? So I go back, run. My bad, a small mistake. So as of now, there was no change made. If I go ahead and run it, yeah, this time we should see changes. So the last name has been changed and the modified date has been is there, right? Now, so this is working just fine. And yeah, there's one more thing which I made a change, a small change. The thing is that while performing the update, we are also checking whether the email address has been modified or not, right? So if we are trying to modify the email address, we are throwing this exception, but as of now we hadn't added any. When this exception is thrown, basically it should be caught at somewhere and should be processed, right? So for that, in the exception handler, I have added this also, right, to handle invalid operation exception. Simple thing, you'll just get an exception, and what you can do, you can simply return the message of that exception, as simple as that. Nothing fancy, right? So I have added that support also, so that if I'm trying to change the email address, let's say this, I get an error that 400 bad and email ID cannot be modified, right? So update is working just fine. Now let's go ahead and try to add one more endpoint, slash remove, and this would be a delete, right? And from body, I think we can only pass, yeah. So here you can see, to remove a user, we are using slash remove endpoint, and it's a delete mapping. That's why slash this is a delete mapping, and I'm using slash remove, right? And it expects a user. When you're going to remove a user or food item, all you need to do is pass only its ID, right? And the ID is this. You don't need to pass the whole thing. So here, as of now in the database there is only one element, there's only one, right? CodeNCode. So once you run it, first of all let's try to remove using a fake ID. Okay, 400 bad requests, and if we provide the valid one, it is deleted 200. Okay, there's one thing, you must see why 400 bad requests. All right, so here when you're trying to fetch it in the service by ID, we are trying to remove user, right? Trying to fetch it, it throws invalid ID exception. If there is an invalid ID exception, it should handle it. For some reason it's not handling it. Slash remove 1% correct, right? Slash remove. In case of invalid ID, some reason getting 400 bad request without any exception. So invalid ID exception we have already handled here. Invalid ID exception is handled here, right? Invalid ID exception 404 not found. This should have been there. All right, we need to see why it is happening. All right, so let's check that. All right, so I found the issue, and that is this. The thing is, it's not able to parse the UUID because it is supposed to be of 36 character. While removing one character, it makes it not equal to the UUID because it is not 36 character anymore. So let's go back to the proper ID, and if I try it with the proper ID, it says there is no user with this ID, right? So the only issue I was getting was because I was deleting some character out of it, right? So if you pass any invalid ID, it will work just fine, right? What I was doing, I was removing one character, so it is not 36 anymore, so the UUID was not able to be mapped properly, right? Because it expects 36 character. So yeah, as you can see, this is not update user, this is delete user. 11 delete user. So all of the endpoints are working fine, right? So all of the endpoints are working just fine. We have tested every single endpoint in the user controller, right? There is one endpoint that is left for us to implement, that is for login. I'll explain about the login endpoint later, and after we will add the login endpoint after we have implemented the security, right? In the next lecture we are going to implement the Spring security in this project. All right, so yeah, this is it for this lecture. Thank you guys for watching. Until the next video drops, keep coding. Thank you.